Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Gimel, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai, Menuchatu Began Eden, Amen. Yes, in yesterday's Mishnah Rabotai, Rabbi Shimon ruled that a person is allowed to make more than 3 piles of manure per bet se'ah. And that Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon, was referring to piles that have at least 10 lesech, 150 se'ah worth of manure. Here, however, Rabbi Shimon is adding in today's Mishnah that making more than 3 piles, it would even be allowed even if each pile is smaller than 10 lesser than 150 se'ah of manure. A person can make 3 piles per bet se'ah in his field. And if he wants to make more than that number of piles, he makes as many as he wants, like the legs of a pot. Machatziv literally means legs of a pot, but we're really referring to is you can make as many piles as you want, even if each pile is smaller than 10 lesech, but it cannot be smaller than 3 lesech, 45 se'ah. Now, even making a large number of relatively small piles, it would not seem like an act of fertilization because you're heaping the manure into piles and not spreading it across the ground. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon, that you can make 3 piles, and even more piles you can make with even less than 10 lesech, as long as it's 3 lesech. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss the opinion of the Chachamim, when the previous Mishnah said you cannot make more than 3 piles of manure per bet se'ah, even if each measures 10 lesech or more. But the Chachamim forbid making more than 3 piles unless he lowers the side of each pile 3 tvachim below the ground, or he raises it 3 tvachim above the ground. Because when the base of the pile is at least 3 tvachim below or 3 tvachim above the ground, it's obvious that you only intend to gather manure in one place and you're not trying to fertilize the land. Therefore, the Chachamim would agree in that case that you're allowed to make more than 3 piles. And the Rambam adds in Chot Shemitah, chapter 2, Halakha 3, that if the bases of the piles are 3 tvachim above or below the ground, you're allowed to make more than 3 piles, even if each pile is smaller than 10 lesech. The Mishnah now is going to discuss a person making one large pile. A person can make all his manure into one large storage pile, meaning instead of making 3 separate piles of 10 lesech each, you can dump all 30 lesech into a single pile and add to it without any limit. And the Rab tells us, even though the Chachamim prohibited more than 3 piles of 10 lesech each, they permitted heaping everything more than 30 lesech into a single pile. Rabbi Meir, however, forbids to make a single pile that has more than 30 lesech, unless he lowers it 3 tvachim into the ground or raises it 3 tvachim above the ground. And the Mefarshim explain that Rabbi Meir agrees that a person can make 3 piles of unlimited size, like we said in the previous Mishnah, but he does hold that if we would allow you to make one single pile of unlimited size, that could ultimately end up covering the entire surface of the field with no gaps, and that would certainly appear like an act of fertilizing the field. Therefore, he says you cannot make a single pile of 30 lesech unless you set it apart from the rest of the field by raising it 3 tvachim above the ground or 3 tvachim below the ground. Now, Rabotai, in the previous Mishnah, we learned that each pile has to have at least 10 lesech. So Mishnah now is going to teach us, what if a person doesn't have 10 lesech, 150 se'ah of manure? He has less. If he only has a small amount of manure, he can store it in a pile in his field, and then he adds to it bit by bit. However, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah prohibits storing a small amount in your field and adding later, unless you lower the site of the pile 3 tvachim below the ground or raise it 3 tvachim above the ground. Or unless he puts some manure on a boulder. Now the Mefarshim explain that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says you're not allowed to store a small amount with the intent to add later, because you might not get any more manure, and then in that case it's going to look like you're fertilizing the field with the initial small amount. So to avoid giving this impression that you're fertilizing the field, you have to lower the side of the pile 3 tvachim, or raise below the ground, or raise it 3 tvachim above the ground. Because now, since the side of the pile is different than the rest of the field, it doesn't look like you're fertilizing the field. Or you can place a small amount on a boulder, even if it's lower than 3 tvachim from the ground, because nothing can be planted on a boulder, so obviously you're not fertilizing the boulder. You're clearly not using it as manure to fertilize. If none of these two options are available, either the raising of 3 tvachim or lowering or putting it on a boulder, you have to wait until you collect the minimum amount of the lesech and then take it all out at once in order to avoid suspicion. Right? If you don't have the 10 lesech. That is Rabotai of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled now is going to discuss a case where a farmer, let's say a farmer has no other place for his animals during Shemitah. Is he allowed to keep them in the field where the crops grow? Because the problem could be they're dropping fertilizer all over the soil. So Mishnah is going to teach us that indeed a farmer who has no other place to put his animals during Shemitah is allowed to keep them in the field where the crops grow, even if they drop fertilizer over the soil. But that's only allowed, obviously, if he doesn't intend to fertilize the field, but he plans on eventually heaping up the manure into storage piles to use the following year. He's not letting it stay there over the soil. Also, the Mishnah is going to tell us he is not allowed to let the animals go over the entire field. He has to confine them to a section of the field that's closed by a fence. A person who wants to pen, he wants to enclose his animals in his field on Shemitah, he can only make an enclosure that's not larger than 2 betzah, 5,000 square amot. Why? Because we don't want the animals to dispose of their waste of fertilizer in the entire field. We want them to limit it to that area. Therefore, you end up showing, by limiting them to a certain area, that you're not using their waste as fertilizer. Because if you really intended to use the animals' waste as fertilizer, you would have let them go all over the field. So when you limit them to a specific section, you avoid that suspicion that you're using it for fertilizer. Once these 2 betzahs are filled with the fertilizer, with the waste, you can pull out the fence on 3 sides of the enclosure, leaving only the middle wall in its place, and then you build a second enclosure on the other side of the middle fence. Now, the reason we're calling it the middle fence is because it's standing between the area of the first and second enclosure, even though it was really one of the 4 walls. Therefore, in the end, it ends up being that you closed off a total area of 4 betzah, which is 2 betzah of the first enclosure plus 2 betzah of the second enclosure, which is basically 10,000 square amot. Now, the Rab does tell us that 4 betzah, 2 enclosures, right, 2 sides of 2 betzah, that's the maximum area in which a person can keep his animals on his field during Shemitah. Before, if it's more than that, you must gather their waste and heap it into the storage piles, right? This is the maximum amount that you're allowed to let them drop their droppings until you heap it into the pile, right? You're not allowed to let your animals occupy a larger area before cleaning, because people will suspect you then of using them to fertilize the land. So basically, what the Rav is telling us is that maximum 4 betzah, you are allowed to let them drop until eventually, I explained it a little differently just now, I want to correct it. You're allowed to have a maximum of 4 betzah, 2 betzah for one enclosure, 2 for the other enclosure, and you're allowed to let the animals roam around this area and they drop their fertilizer droppings, and then at the end you'll collect it all and put it into a pile. But if it would be more than 2 betzah per enclosure, more than 4 betzah of area for the animals to roam, then you would not let them leave the droppings. You have to pick it up right away. You don't want to give the suspicion that you're using their droppings as fertilizer. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Bet Shmona Sein. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is even more lenient. He says you're allowed to erect 4 enclosures, one after the other, in the way that we said. You build you enclose one area, remove 3 walls, you have a middle, then you make another area, and then you remove 3 walls, and you have the middle, for a total of 8 betzah. Because according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, you don't have to heap the manure into piles until after the animals have occupied 8 betzah, which is 4 enclosures of 2 betzah each. And these 4 enclosures include the Mefarshim tell us the original one as well. So it's the original one plus 3 more. So we have 4 enclosures of 2 betzah in area. So until now we were speaking about a large field, right? But what if my entire field is 4 se'ah, right? If his entire field is only 4 betzah, in which case after you make the second enclosure, you have to fence in you will have fenced in the entire field, which now the animals are roaming over the entire field. Mishayer mimena miktzat mipnei marit ayin. You have to leave part of the field empty without any animals, because otherwise you're going to give the appearance of marit ayin, of wrongdoing, that you're fertilizing the field. Because until now we spoke, you have a field that's 10 betzah, and you close off an area, 2 areas of 2, closing off 4. So now it doesn't look like you're fertilizing the whole field. But if your entire field is 4 betzah, and the animals are not roaming the entire field, you're giving off the impression that you're using them as fertilizer. Therefore, you have to leave part of the field empty to avoid any marit ayin. Because if you're going to fence in the entire field, even if you just do 2 betzah at a time before you heap it into piles, you're giving the appearance that you're intending to fertilize the land. Therefore, you have to keep part of the land free of animals to avoid the suspicion. Now the Mishnah, or just to point out, Rabotai, the Mishnah now is going to conclude, it's going to explain what do you do after all the enclosures are filled with manure. 2 according to the first Tana, 4 according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. The Mishnah says you have to remove the manure from the enclosed area and place it in the field into piles, right? Once you fill up the enclosure with manure, you have to remove the manure and place it in the field in piles, just like those who take the manure to their fields are allowed to do so. Meaning, you're allowed to form 3 piles of at least 10 lesech per betzah, like we said in Mishnah 1. In order to not allow the land now to be fertilized, you have to finally take it all into a pile. And the Rab does tell us, the halacha is not like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. You are not allowed to have 4 enclosures of 2 betzah equaling 8. The maximum you're allowed to have is 2 enclosures of 2 betzah equaling 4. That is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.